Do you want a knife? Zephyr asked as soon as I stepped inside his apartment. My impression was of low ceilings and more brightly colored angular decorations than I'd expected from the guy's businesswear. It smelled like fruity soap. I want to say we won't need them, I said as I bent to avoid the ceiling. But it's good to be prepared. Do you have any that I can hide in a pocket? I demonstrated how much storage space there was in my brown high-collared coat, which I wore with my braid tucked down the back. As far as I could tell, that long hair was my most identifying feature to the average turtledillo. There would be no disguising my species, but I could at least make an attempt at disguising which human I was. On Zephyr's insistence, I accepted a slender pocket knife that reminded me of an ice pick. It seemed designed to pierce a turtledillo's natural armor. I didn't ask where he had gotten it. I also didn't ask, moments later, how he expected me to fit comfortably in his tiny car. Luckily for us, I fold up well. The back seat was barely wide enough for me to sit sideways, knees to chin, hoping that he would drive safely. The seat had a weird texture that wasn't quite worth complaining about, and the floor mat stank of fuel. I dearly hoped there wasn't a leak. As we took off, Zephyr talked about things he'd uncovered. The celebrities who had died of overdoses similar to his cousin, the children who had been sold dangerous things, the bystanders who had wound up in the wrong place at the wrong time. The way he talked, it sounded like there was a far-reaching network among the rockback criminal element, possibly with all the clout of a few organized crime rings I could name. The fact that the local criminals appeared to be working with off-world smugglers made it more alarming. This could be huge, I thought from the back seat. If an underground empire like the Borsnats or the Wheelers is getting a foothold here, then it'll be worth risking my career to stop them. We rode in silence for a while. I just hate not knowing what we're walking into. The ride seemed to take forever, but when signs appeared that we were getting close, it was somehow far too soon. For me, anyway. Zephyr was as hyper as a squirrel. I had to remind him to calm down a little, so people wouldn't wonder what his problem was. He nodded and took a few deep breaths, driving with exaggerated care and looking for street addresses. There were none, of course. This was that kind of neighborhood. Directions given here were more along the lines of, turn left at the collapsed red building, turn right at the broken statue, and go under the bridge made of abandoned construction materials. It was not classy, is what I'm trying to say. It was also super dark, because of course the glowflowers here were wilted and faint. The signs of various skeezy businesses lit the streets. Pedestrians hurried by with quick steps, looking over their shoulders. I started to wonder if Zephyr's car would be a target for break-ins. I had a hard time telling how its style matched up to those I saw parked nearby. It was in good shape, which made it look valuable, but I hoped that it wasn't a model that would start losing bits the moment we walked around a corner. Zephyr parked in the brightest spot we could find. Everybody knew that criminals were more likely to steal things in the dark, where no one could see them. I assumed it worked that way with turtledillo psychology at any rate. Speaking of turtledillo psychology, I learned something interesting that night. Or rather, I had it confirmed. See, there's this human idea of scary aliens with mandible mouths, and I'd heard that the beak-faced turtledillos had a similar uneasiness about our flappy human lips. Silly, I know, but I'd wondered about that, and never had a good chance to ask a friend if they found my face unsettling. But I got the perfect opportunity. It was when we'd left the car in the distance. Zephyr spotted a landmark and hurried ahead, right around the corner and into a trio of armed muggers. He made an undignified squeak, trying to jump back but finding himself faced with several knives more dangerous than the one in his pocket. The leader was already demanding money. They didn't see me. It was perfect. I stepped out of the shadows, arms wide as I loomed over them, bellowing with all my might. Rawr! Booga booga! Habla blah blah! Grr! Thupt! The muggers stared up at me for a heartbeat, with the widest eyes I'd ever seen, then bolted for their lives. I yelled after them, blowing raspberries and adding in some dog barks for good measure. When they had disappeared from sight, I collapsed into laughter, leaning against the side of the building. Did you see their faces? I asked Zephyr, who was regaining his own breath. Who? I thought they were going to pee themselves. That was excellent. I stayed there chuckling while Zephyr pulled himself together. Yes, he managed. That was well done. Thank you. I waved it off. Oh, my pleasure, absolutely. I've always wanted to foil a mugging. Tell me, what was scarier, the RAR or the THBT? The turtledillo gave me his honest opinion, the THBT, and soon we were on our way again, though this time much more carefully. I peeked around corners first, higher than the average mugger would be expecting. We had no more trouble. I was almost disappointed. But, as the rules of such things go, a second encounter surely would have gone much worse for us, so it was probably for the best that we didn't meet anyone else. When we reached the building that Lumi had directed us to, I found it to be decidedly Earth-like. The sort of construction that I'd have thought they'd learned from us, if I wasn't pretty sure the Alliance was too new for that. At any rate, that side of things wasn't my expertise. This nightclub was big and sturdy, made of poured concrete with blacked-out windows, a glowing red sign, and a bouncer out front with locals milling around under a corrugated awning. Zephyr's pace slowed, but he squared his armored shoulders and strutted forward with me, towering behind him. He probably thought he looked important, with his businesslike stride and tall alien as backup. I let him think it. I was pretty sure that he wasn't impressing anyone. Certainly not the bouncer. That beefy individual looked like she could have taken on the entire street and come out on top. Her shell was painted a fire red that was much like the sign. I found myself noticing how the larger-than-average arm muscles caused her natural armor to separate a little, which was surely a weakness. I wondered how that factored into knife fights, but set the thought aside for another day. The bouncer regarded us with the same unruffled gaze that everyone was graced with. Zephyr stopped right in front of her. "Lumi sent us," he said, still trying to be cool. The bouncer replied with a quick look up and down for both of us, then a step aside to open the door. "You'll find Rumble at the back," she said. "He's expecting you." Zephyr nodded a crisp thanks, as if he had expected no less, and strode past. I thanked the bouncer, wanting to whirl around and booga-booga the onlookers, but I nobly resisted. I did hear the conversation start up as the door was closing, though. Indoors, we found a dark, loud hallway with red-orange lights, a ceiling that was only slightly too low, and ventilated air thick with rock-back body odor. It honestly smelled better than human BO. How unfair is that? The floor was painted matte black. The walls were covered in abstract, fiery patterns that were surprisingly artistic, tapering upwards into smoky clouds on a gray ceiling. I almost tripped while I looked up at it. Zephyr saw nothing, striding along in front of me. I recovered just before we turned a corner to see a dance floor full of turtledillos. They were more graceful than I'd honestly expected. And the music wasn't bad. Not much more than drums, but a good beat. Most importantly, the ceiling was higher here. Same decoration scheme, though, with spots of light moving over everything in specks of red, orange, and yellow. Zephyr clearly didn't care. He looked to make sure I was following, then began weaving his way through the crowd at the edge of the dance floor. We passed red-curtained booths and doorways to private rooms that I didn't want to speculate about. I didn't have to. Zephyr caught my attention to jerk a disdainful thumb toward them. "This is one of those clubs that sells illegal entertainment on the side," he told me over the music, yellow lights passing over his face. "It's only illegal because rich people commissioned the films to be available to only them, but they got sold anyway." He sniffed haughtily. "These are barely criminals." With that, he strode off toward the back of the dance floor. I readjusted my impression of the place and followed. A sitting area filled with black couches lined the wall, which was likely where this Rumble character waited. The crowd parted with impressive speed. I couldn't say whether it was awe, fear, or the prudent desire not to be stepped on by someone so much taller than they were. Either way, it suited me just fine. Zephyr plowed ahead and I followed, stepping carefully. Wouldn't do to trip now. We made it to the couches without incident. Zephyr narrowed in on the likely choice of Rumble, the large fellow seated in the middle of the biggest couch, flanked by guards and sycophants of one type or another. As we approached, he waved for us to join him. I wondered again just what I was expected to fix, especially in this sort of place. Did the dance floor use off-world lights? How did any of it fit in with stopping the smugglers? "Welcome," said Rumble in a subterranean bass that made his name choice immediately obvious. He spoke with authority and an easy confidence that made me respect him on an instinctive level. Some things are universal, I guess. He surely would have had a harder time of it if he'd been graced with a squeaky balloon voice. "Lumi never disappoints. Would you like a bite before we get down to business?" He waved a single hand toward the bowls scattered across the mirrored table in front of him. I could only guess what sort of insect-based delicacy they contained. Zephyr answered for me. "No, thank you," he said firmly. "We'd rather get right to it. This is important to everyone." The larger turtledillo regarded him with amusement. "And you are?" Zephyr stared right back, radiating as much confidence as his tiny accountant's frame could muster. "Secundus Zephyr Mudlark, problem solver. Lumi tells us that this broken thing of yours can bring down the smugglers from off-world, and I cannot wait to see it." Rumble laughed. "Aren't you just precious?" he asked. "You've got fire in you, I'll give you that. Sure you wouldn't rather knock shells in the back room?" Zephyr stood stiffly, trying to formulate a response to the sudden and, to me at least, completely unexpected proposition. It's hard to tell when a turtledillo's blushing at the best of times, what with the scales covering much of their faces, and the uneven lighting in here made things even more complicated. But I was relatively sure that Zephyr was blushing. "I thank you for the offer, kind sir," he finally said, much to Rumble's amusement. "If the circumstances were different, perhaps, but our mission tonight is of the utmost importance. The smugglers deserve a violent end." The large fellow laughed again, patting his smaller neighbor on the shoulder, who I just now realized was a slender male. I really needed to start paying more attention to shell ridges. "Well said, lovely," Rumble said. "And what about you, Treetop?" he continued, turning to me. "Are you driven by a deep hatred for smugglers as well?" "If they're the reason all of my co-workers and I might get shipped home in shame, then yes," I said. "Will you kindly tell us what you need fixed and how that will stop them?" He levered himself to his feet. "Come see for yourselves." With bodyguards and hangers-on in tow, he led the way down a hallway that got quieter with each step away from the dance floor. The ceiling was just high enough for me to stand up, though I had to duck through several doors as we walked. Rumble spoke without looking back. "It's a rare day when someone threatens my territory and doesn't treat a warning shot with the respect it deserves. I guess times have changed. Used to be you could run a fine, illicit business, bothering nobody but the law grubbers, and only have to snap at a few upstarts now and then. There hasn't been a full-on street fight in a fingerless number of years." I mentally ran that through my idiom translator, remembering how many fingers the turtledillos had to count with while Rumble went on. "But now," he said, "now these invisible mud eggs are bringing off-world merchandise in, causing problems for everyone. They step on more turfs all the time. With how long their list of enemies is now, our original plan was to unite the gangs and beat them into the dirt once and for all. Send the message that they're not welcome, despite the traders who keep signing up to do their distribution. But," he pointed upward with both right hands, "most of those bosses are cloaca kissers who can't be reasoned with." One of the bodyguards snorted but held his silence. I privately wondered about the translation for the insult. It could just as easily have been butt-nuzzlers, though I supposed it amounted to the same thing. Rumble was still talking. "The new plan is to let the police do the hard work for us. They just need to be able to find the off-world egg holes." He looked sharply at me. "That's the part we'll need your expertise for. In here." He told most of the crowd to wait for him outside another low doorway, bringing only a couple of the bodyguard types with him. I held my questions and followed into what proved to be a high-ceilinged garage workshop sort of place. The door locked behind Zephyr. The other door, a large one for vehicles, was already shut. No windows. A number of single-seater air cars lined up along the wall, painted in the same fiery color scheme as the building's decor. In the center of the room waited the fabled off-world tech. Before Rumble said a thing, I recognized it as A, a hovercycle, B, beat to hell, and C, not made by either of our species. Judging by the shape of the seat, it was designed to fit somebody with a long thorax and multiple legs. Either arms or tentacles, too. Probably one of the insect-like species. Of course, the criminals are from a creepy race, I thought. Why do you have to be a stereotype like that, you smugglers? You're letting down the rest. We managed to score this when we clashed with the mud eggs, Rumble said. It was already a little broken. Otherwise, we never would have seen it. The creature that was driving it got away with the goods it was trying to sell in our territory, but we kept this scooter. He picked up a wrench and stepped forward. Let me show you what the problem is. With deep misgivings about how much he expected me to do, I followed. When we got it, Rumble said, this part here showed a chart of some kind that marked where the soft shells and their ships were, a stealth breaker of the highest order. He looked at me significantly. If we'd had this kind of tech when they first showed up, they would never have gotten a foothold. I was curious about what kind of turf Rumble was protecting. Did the off-worlders have better holovids than the restricted films he sold? Or was it purely a physical territory? But this didn't seem the time to ask. We're hoping, Rumble said, that we can use this thing to track them down. Either we shred their ship enough that the invisibility shuts down, and the police take them out for us, or we carve off enough pieces to show those thick-headed officials that they'll have to believe the report of where the ship is. But the problem is, he said while pointing with the wrench, it stopped working. Somewhere between grabbing this thing and getting it back here, the chart disappeared. I told the crew not to touch it, 'cause they might break it worse. I'm hoping you can fix it proper. We need that chart. Well, I said, let me take a look. This was not my area of expertise in the slightest, but since I was there, I might as well see. With Zephyr urging me on, I looked for buttons or other obvious controls. Buttons, yes, squishy ones. Makes sense if these folks have pointy exoskeleton claws. No idea about the language, though. Is that a language? Has to be. And of course, everything's black, not color-coded. That would be too easy. Well, this one's big and looks important. Is it too much to hope it's a power button? I pushed it. Nothing happened other than the blank screen moving in a way it probably wasn't meant to. Wondering about loose wires, I lifted the screen into a more likely-looking position. It lit up. I made a happy noise at the same time Rumble did. Then we were both overshadowed by an explosion outside the building. Rumble swore and raced for the hallway. He directed one of his guards to stay with us, and with the valuable hoverbike. Then he was gone in a slam of the door. Before I could do more than exchange worried looks with Zephyr, something made a distinct zapping sound. My muscles locked up and I toppled over sideways. More zaps put Zephyr and the guard on the floor with me. All I could see was a patch of oily floor in the back of Zephyr's head. I listened with everything I had, picking up a mighty ruckus of some sort out front, which almost covered the sound of the door locking from the inside. The big rolling door opened, and that wasn't quiet at all. Someone shouted in the hallway, ran toward us, found the door locked. Then I was being dragged by my feet toward the open door. When I got close, my frozen eyes caught a glimpse of an empty nighttime street. I was dragged out onto it, then up a ramp of some sort, and an invisible spaceship bloomed into view around me. Whoever was pulling me dropped me in the cargo bay before going back for Zephyr. I heard multiple feet, insect-ish. Zephyr slid to rest beside me. Back in the building, the broken hover cycle creaked, but the small door creaked louder, and the invisible person gave up on the bike before Rumble broke the door down. All those footsteps pattered back into the ship, along with words in a chittery, chattery language that I wasn't even close to fluent in. The door to the hallway crashed open. The door to the ship closed in silence. We were well and truly captured. So much for my worst-case scenario, I thought, trying not to panic. This wasn't even on the list.